Okay, for the second part of the values, and do some visual effects later here. So ended up with filial piety. Next one, and really key one here is the idea of law. This idea of teamwork and harmonious relationships. This is the idea that within the group that you're a part of, whether it be the EA, whether it be the Oyman-Colvin relationship that you've got, that you've got to work, whatever it is, there's the idea that everyone has to work together. Now, this one is, in a corporate sense, is used for the corporation. And at least superficially, this is why in Japanese companies, everyone seems to work well together. This is because this is a basic expectation of people, is that they will work effectively in a group. They'll suborn whatever their personal interest or goals or needs or even opinions for the group. And this applies universally in Japan. This is one reason why the Japanese are so incredibly polite, and you very almost never see any sort of conflict or argument in any sort of public setting. The exception would be, of course, when people drink alcohol, because when people drink alcohol, that means that your honest ikigai interpretation or opinion of something is supposed to come out. But even that's part of law, because you're doing that after everyone's consumed alcohol, so it's legit. You're not just sort of like venting, because I've had enough or something like that. There's times and places that are structured in Japanese society for saying what you feel like you need to say, but you're never going to disrupt this law. Um, I can't imagine Americans working effectively in this. I mean, folks at Chaminade are very nice, but the idea that a bunch of academics could actually practice Japanese law is just, it's beyond not hypothetical. Having seen that, you go into any Japanese workplace, and this is what you'll see all the time. Now, one of the side effects of this, just as a note, is this is why when you go into Japanese companies, you see very little variation in terms of outfits. Especially the salaryman outfit. If you look closely, you'll find that folks of higher rank in the system have better outfits. But with the exception of IT and other types of, like creative firms or something like that, you're not going to find a lot of variation in terms of outfits. And that's actually part of this idea of law or teamwork. So teamwork and harmonious relationships aren't just behavioral; they're also visible. So you go to work, you work as a group. You generally take lunch as a group, or some subgroup. In major Japanese companies, in fact, even some middle-sized ones, you'll invariably be wearing an outfit that has a logo on it, which is your company, emblem or whatever you call it. Or you will, if it's an old company like some Matsushita, for example, they actually have a pin that you put on your jacket. Um, which is a corporate pin, which it's a Matsushita logo. So this is this idea of law, and this trumps everything. Everything is subordinate to this, and so yeah, it is the way it is. I've never actually worked for Japanese companies. We do consulting work with them, but I've never actually worked for one, and I don't think I could because my behavioral pattern, I can understand why. I can appreciate it. I can even do it for short periods of time, but there's no way I could keep it up for very long. I'm too opinionated, and have so much ego that I want everyone else to hear the opinion when I finally lose it. So yeah, I would never fit in a Japanese company. And this is one reason why foreigners that work for Japanese companies very frequently quit very, very early, especially if they think they've been hired because they have some expertise. Because in a Japanese company, if law is the key, then no one really cares what your expertise is. It's the harmonious relationships that are key. So law is a fascinating concept, um, because Japanese actually do this. I'd say 98% of the time. The other 2% is when they're drinking, and this is why you always go drinking with your coworkers. You always go drinking with the folks you work with, so that you can, in that 2% that are sort of like some variant of law. Alcohol means that people can actually share to a certain extent, share most of their real opinion of a situation. Then, of course, once people are, once the drinking episode is ended, then it's gone, and everyone might remember well, everyone does remember what you said, but it won't be held against you any more than anything that someone said about you can be held against them. And again, this is this dominance of the idea of law. Harmonious relationships are absolutely key. Totally different than Korean society. And actually, yeah, I mean, Chinese companies might have this to a very sort of hypothetical, limited extent, but in this regard, Chinese tend to be much more like their American counterparts. If they don't say something, it's because they've got a reason for not saying something. It's not because it's some sort of like social dictate. In fact, here let's switch here. Okay. This is Miyajima, which is a really famous island in Kyushu. It's famous for the famous red torii that's just offshore, which has got to been photographed like 18 gazillion times. And God knows how many YouTube videos have done it, especially tourists going to Miyajima. The interesting thing is very rarely in those tourist accounts, I've watched a few, do you actually see what's one of the major aspects of Miyajima, and that's these little boogers. These are Asian deer. Now we have these in Hawaii, they're an absolute nightmare. Don't get me started on Maui, the amount of trouble they've caused. Um, they're very cute. These are full size, they're not babies. And in their home environment, the Japanese islands, they're fine. Well, I assume they're fine. I never thought to ask someone in Miyajima if they're a problem. Problem is in Hawaii, they breed like rabbits, and because they're cute, it's considered very poor form to just go in and whack them. So they become like the cuter new form of goats for rural areas of Maui and Molokai, and I think all the islands. I'm not really too sure. I'm not sure if they're a big deal on Oahu. But anyways, so for our purposes, the key thing we're looking at is sort of two. One is we've got two groups. I think, as I remember, this is a long time ago. I think there's 5 girls here. No, no, yeah, there's 4 girls that are a group. There's 2 girls and 2 guys that are a group. I don't think they were part of the same group. Both groups were obviously students. I would guess high school because they don't have in elementary and middle school. They usually make them wear badges so that you can't get lost. In high school, they tend to be a little more sophisticated. I'm not sure what you want to call it. Anyways, so in this group, the girl you can't see here and the 3 here, what you've got is one of the deers trying to steal snacks out of her purse, which is they're very good at that. And they've been around long enough to know that 1, girls carry snacks. 2, if you chase girls carrying snacks, you'll almost invariably get something. So there's some real interesting learned behavior patterns that go on with these deer and the tourist, which is what these are. Yeah, and the deers win 99.999% of the time. Now, the key thing for our part is this group of 4 girls would be exhibiting wa. They're working as a group. The ones, quote, helping, unquote, the other get away from the deer that's trying to snarf her, goodies in her bag. This group here is acting as a group. 1, 2, yeah, there's another girl here in gray. So these 2 guys, 2 girls are acting as a group. So again, what you'd have is wa. These folks are going to function as a unit. They're going to be very careful to be seen as a union. There's juniors and seniors here. I'd be willing to bet that these 2 girls, that's the senior, that's the junior. Of this group here, I don't know. I have a vague remembrance that the lady in gray here is actually looked like she was the senior. Well, actually, this couple, while they were acting sort of like a couple, looked like they acted sort of as seniors, and these 2 were juniors. So again, you can literally just see in a couple of seconds if you're watching these folks. You can actually see the junior-senior dynamic take place. You can also see this idea that the group functions as a group. You don't see anyone here doing individual stuff. These 4 folks are one group. These 4 folks are a group. And, since Japanese do this from literally day one, you're not going to see anyone having to work at exhibiting wa. It's so much ingrained into the Japanese psyche that it's auto behavior, it's subliminal behavior. In the same way that Needi and Oya and Koban relationship, I'd argue, in Japanese society is subliminal. It's not even, people don't even think about it. They just fall into that category. So on one hand, you've sort of got this dynamic taking place. And, this is just a casual social setting, just a tourist on a little island being harassed by a bunch of not very hungry deer. Um, but on the other hand, it's actually symptomatic of this whole set of behavior patterns that are entirely consistent in Japanese behavior. I mean, these folks were just here. We were just taking pictures because I was taking pictures because I thought it'd be useful for class to actually see the deer in action. So, it wasn't like we were walking around the island trying to find some folks doing an Oyabun Koban relationship. It's just, anyone we would have pictured if there was someone else would have been probably some exhibit of that. The other thing, which we'll get into later, but it's a good example of that, is what you're also dealing with is these deer aren't deer. Well, I don't know, this sounds like a bad pun anyways. They're actually considered to be vessels for spirits, or what are Japanese call kami. So on one hand, this guy's sort of watching this deer, and I think he's being a little bit circumspect. I think that one had horns, or had vestigial horns. So anyways, he's watching the deer. These two girls are dealing with this deer. And the reason you just don't smack the deer and tell it to get out of your face, or whatever they would do if, say, Yosemite or some stupid, or Yellowstone or something like that, is the fact that on one hand these are three deer, on the other hand spirits, which inhabit everything in Japan. They're not ghosts; they're spirits. We'll get into those later. They live in all sorts of places. Among other things, that's actually the function of these lanterns. Lanterns are spirit houses. The other things that spirits like to hang around in for some reason, there's actually a couple of stories about this, but I'm pretty sure the belief existed long before the story showed up, is deer are a place that spirits hang out in. So this deer might just be being a deer. It's just doing whatever deer stuff it does. The deer in front of it that's trying to snack the girl's goodies might actually be a deer that's possessed by a kami temporarily. So deers are receptors, containers, I'm not sure what you want to call it, for spirits. And that's why you don't mess with them. You don't smack them, you don't touch them, you don't know whatever, because on one hand, it might just be a deer. On the other hand, you might have just smacked a spirit. And kami are unpredictable in a gazillion different ways, as we'll see. But one of the side effects is you're smacking something that can do a lot more damage to you than you can do to it. So the deer on Miyajima are a good example of kami, of spirit beings, not actually necessarily possessed at any particular time, but they have an innate ability to be possessed by kami or spirits. And also, just as a side, when you see lanterns like this is actually true also in the Chinese system. Lanterns are very rarely for light. I know this one's actually got a light in it, but that's for tourists. These things are actually houses for spirits. They would be lit with little lanterns at night, or candles more accurately. But that's because kami like candles. Kami like candles because if you put a candle in there and you light it up, you're inviting kami there, and the kami's attitude is you want us around. You're PRing us. So it's like giving them a gift, which in hindsight might be what the kami and the deer is thinking. Whatever she's got in that bag is a gift. She just hasn't got around to giving it to me yet. Anyways. Okay. One thing you hear in Japan too, you get really tired of it. And you can actually even be watching Japanese dialogue, especially if you talk about athletes or kids that are getting ready to take exams or anything where effort's involved, and the idea of success is involved, is you'll hear the word gambatte. Gambatte is a very uniquely Japanese term. The Chinese don't have anything like that, at least not in Mandarin that I know. And I'm not sure. Koreans might. I don't know. I don't know Koreans. I don't know if they actually have. I would suspect they don't have the concept. It's a very Japanese. To me, it's a very Japanese concept. Probably uniquely Japanese. If you ever want to see this played out to its ultimate extent, see if you can find full, or at least one or two inning part of the Japanese high school baseball championship. And what you'll find is when Japanese do stuff, they're expected to put out their maximum effort maximum energy, maximum commitment. If you ever even go to a pro game, if you go down to Hiroshima and you go watch the cart play, you'll see this. You'll see someone hits a drive into the outfield, and so the center fielder runs back to get it. It's going to hit the wall, and there's no way he can catch it. Nonetheless, he's still expected to actually go and literally run into the wall. Looks like a bad example of an old, Wiley, whatever the Coyote name, one of the Roadrunner cartoons. You'll see these guys. These are pro players. Bang! Right into a wall. These, we were watching one game, and he was unconscious. The crowd was just stoked. And I'm sure his salary probably went up, a little bit that month, that year, because that was Gambatte. There was no way he was going to catch the ball. There was no way he was even particularly close to catching the ball. That sucker must have been at least 15 feet over his head. He would have been better off to just sort of back off and catch it on the rebound. But nope, there was a 1 in a million chance you might get it. Therefore, you haul your ass and run full bore right into the wall. And yeah, it's so Japanese. Gambatte is the idea that you have to do your utmost effort. Now, the interesting thing is what you find is you'll find this frequently if you actually watch like pro baseball in Japan. I don't watch other pro sports. Well, I watch sumo, but sumo's a little different. Sumo, you actually do Gambatte. You don't have any choice. You're on stage. But if you watch pro baseball in Japan, what you'll find is if you know baseball, and one of my brothers actually was a professional player, there's an interesting difference between your utmost exam and the utmost perceived exam. So in Japan, what you have is you've got to show that you're doing your utmost. Now, this Japanese, they won't usually admit this unless they've been drinking. If they're drinking, Japanese will tell you everything. But what you will see is that in many situations, if you know the person well, they've actually got a skill set that's more than what you're seeing. So what they'll do is they'll do something that's actually not that hard for them to do, but they'll make it look really, really hard. And they're doing that as a form of public performance because two reasons. One is because as far as they're concerned, the other members in the group, can't do as good of a job. So you don't want to make them look bad. So you can't be too far ahead. You want to be part of the group. Secondly, is you can't slack off because Japanese have hyper antenna for that, so they're going to hate you even worse. So what you've got is in a very calculated way, you've got to spend absolutely your visible amount of effort getting something done to make sure that it gets done at almost exactly the same time as everyone else, and it's not done much better than anyone else's. So Japanese can spend an enormous amount of intellectual effort and actually a lot of really good acting to appear to do gambatte when they're not. Now, this actually causes a huge amount of trouble for Japanese companies. I've only heard this superficially from folks when they were venting during a after work drinking session. But if there's actually a member of the group who just does not have it together and they just can't do well, then the whole group gets dragged down because you can't do more. You can't do much more than your least effective member. You can do a little bit more, but not a lot. So you'll actually get groups when they're drinking trying to come up with ways to, person X is just, they're about as smart as a doorpost. And the group's getting in trouble because they can't keep up. And yet the rest of the group would have no trouble, getting ahead, much less keeping up. What you have to do then is find ways to get other members of the group to help X in such a way that X can at least pretend and actually sees that they're now working up to the potential of the entire group because somehow their gambatte has not only improved, but their actual skill level has improved with it. And you can occasionally, you'd have to spend some time with a Japanese company. You have to know who the players are to understand what you're watching, but it's not uncommon. I would think in some companies, it's actually probably really common. I would suspect, especially for car manufacturers. Well, actually, no, probably more so the folks who do retail, like the big companies in Asia. But I'd be willing to bet that you'd see a lot of this type of thing where someone's an absolutely lousy salesperson, but the rest of the sales group that sells, appliances, whatever they do as a group, is going to have to come up with some way to improve that, the poor person's performance so that the rest of the group can, move up more to their potential. So Gambatte is an interesting situation. It is very much how Japanese operate. But what you're seeing is I would argue pretty frequently, is actually not the maximum effort someone could really do, but it's the maximum sort of elegant effort to keep it within the bounds of harmony. Gaijin. Gaijin is an interesting concept. Gaijin is to Japanese and Japan in general, in Japanese language, Gaijin would be the equivalent of haole in the 19th century Hawaii, in the sense that haole meant people that had no breath, had no mana in their speech. In the same way, Gaijin means outsider. So they in some ways, they actually ended up getting used sort of similar fashion. But in their original form, they were actually very similar. Because haole in the original sense it could imply anyone outside of your group. So if you were Hawaiian from, say, the east side of Maui, from, say, Hana or Kahiki-Nui or something like that, haole could imply folks from, say, Kauai or something else who you knew absolutely nothing about, who were total strangers to you, who you didn't have even some vague genealogical relationship to, and therefore they were, to all intents and purposes, they were aliens. And not surprisingly, of course, when the Europeans show up, they're going to get labeled by the same thing because, of course, they're the quintessential example of aliens. By the mid-late 20th century, the term changes a lot in terms of who it is, and now it's become largely a label. Well, among folks that don't speak Hawaiian, it's become largely a label of Anglo-Americans. But even then, it's still very frequently, at least with the folks that I deal with, is very much in terms of Anglo-American values. In other words, someone who doesn't embrace, understand, or care about the way things are done in a Hawaiian society and Hawaiian social values. Gaijin is very much the same thing in Japan. It originally meant folks who are outsiders. Now that would be Japanese from Kyushu if you're from Kyoto and in Honshu. That could be Koreans, Chinese, it could be Europeans if it's the 19th century. It really didn't make any difference. It was just someone who was outside your system, outside your network. Now, what that means, as I mentioned last time, is in a rather terrifying way, is that means that there are no rules for how you treat those folks. And actually, to go back, this was traditionally typical also in Hawaii. If you're part of a population of Keiki-Nui, again, someone comes down from Kauai or somewhere in the north, and you have no relationships, and there's no way to build a relationship in the sense there's no shared common ancestor, they're not part of the same clan, whatever it is, then you might treat that person well, you might treat that person poorly. And even in the early historical period, we have a couple examples of people who were treated well, then treated poorly. Why? Because there's no rules, there's no etiquette or moral, ethical rules to treating someone who's outside. Rules only apply to insiders. Gaijin was exactly the same. Gaijin was basically the label in Japan. One of the reasons it was used was sort of telling, well, if you told someone they were Gaijin, but especially if you talked about someone in the third person, they were the Gaijin, you're basically telling the group you talk to that this person is basically a thing. They're not human. You have no relationship with them, and therefore you have no moral, ethical consequences to the way that you treat them. And this, of course, goes back to what I said about the Japanese, in the late 19th through the 19th World War II period, in terms of dealing with prisoners or folks outside of Japan. I should point out that even today, you could argue that Gaijin, though it's getting less, but you could argue at least until the 1970s that Gaijin would also apply to Okinawans, even though they were technically part of metropolitan Japan and are. And I would argue in some ways they still are Gaijin. You do not see any, I cannot think of any Okinawans in any position of authority in Japan. And then it was also certainly even today, certainly applied to Ainu in the north. They are still Gaijin. So Gaijin now in Japan is usually applied to foreigners, non-Japanese. But that term is a real tricky one, and in many cases still has the same connotations that it did, say a century ago. Okay, now for a whole set of values, and we're going to see a bunch of images sort of tied to this. Japanese, and again, some of these are also Chinese. I'll try to remember and emphasize when they're the same. So I'll just call them, some will call Asian universals, some will call uniquely Japanese. The first is an Asian universal. Um, in Asian societies, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and again, mainly Chinese and Japanese, that's the two I'm most familiar with. What you're going to find is there's a tremendous value placed on subtlety. Being having knowledge, as traditionally in Hawaii, since knowledge was mana, having knowledge about something is a manifestation of sophistication. Of course, given the importance of education in Asia, both was and is, especially in China, subtlety is a huge deal. Now, if you remember back a couple of videos ago, or a couple of videos ago, I showed you the guy doing the calligraphy in water on the pavement where it turns to ice. That's a classic example of subtlety in Asia. On one hand, there's a game where you're writing part of a poem out there, and the visitors who want to play the game have to sort of figure out what it is. Now, I should point out, if you do this in China, you don't actually say it. You don't actually say it out loud what the answer is. You just make faces or nods. So now you figured it out because you don't want to. Yeah, well, you just don't want to. But notice how also the type of calligraphy he was doing was an example of subtlety. It was semi-scholarly. So regular folks can read it, but regular folks have a hard time reading it. So it'd be like reading script. I think a large part of Americans can still read script, but they don't read it well and they have to actually think about it. So the calligraphy that he was using does two things. One is it tells a few folks, I can't read this. It tells the other folks two things. One is this is an educated piece of poetry because the way it's written, the actual characters. Secondly, is the guy writing the characters is obviously a sophisticated person because they can actually do those characters. And really, really well. Those are beautiful characters he's doing, especially if he's writing the buggers in water. So you can't even see them when they go down. Now, what this does then is it makes things selectively inclusive in the sense that there's going to be, if you're looking at something, there'll be the people that understand. And there'll be the large majority of the population, the vast majority, which won't understand. And so it's a real clever, very Asian way to define group membership by virtue of hidden knowledge. Now, what you're not going to say is, what you're not going to have is someone suddenly jumping up and down, waving their arm and saying, oh, I know the answer, and then blow it for everyone. The whole trick is you don't let it be known that you do know the answer. Let's try some examples here. I personally think this is one of the best. This is it's a combination of tea house, but it was also sort of like an Airbnb as far as I could tell. This is in Kyoto. This is on the walk right near the art museum. So right across the street is the big canal. This place is famous for the cherry blossoms. Across the street, the blossoms are all in bloom. So it's spectacular. So it's like a gazillion tourists, and this includes Japanese, because you have to remember Kyoto is the culture, fashion, style capital of Japan. So it's Japanese go there all the time to sort of pick up a bit of style, you might say, or see style in action. What you've got is a little side doorway. And I use this in the design class because it's one of the quintessential examples of Japanese style. You've got a version of ikebana. You've got an arrangement here on a table. This particular type of table, I can't remember exactly where this would be. It wouldn't be in a Toriyama. I can't think of. Yeah, I've seen them, but I can't remember exactly what they're used for. I think they're usually used for flower arrangements. So here you've got the sidewalk. This is a street. So what you've got here is notice there's different textures. I mean, Chinese are even more into this than Japanese. So you've got the smooth, granite or whatever it is to the floor. You've got the rough granite surface here. You've got the textured plastered surface here. You've intentionally got discoloring here. This isn't because they haven't done maintenance. This is intended this way. I can guarantee they actually work at keeping it this way. In the same way, you've got a small doorway, not the main doorway. The main doorway is over here. You've got a small side door here. And they've intentionally not varnished it or stained it. So this is just cedar, Japanese cedar, turning into older Japanese cedar. You've got the one light here. Now, I've also got the security camera. You're not supposed to notice that. So notice how you've got very little, on one hand, you've got very little in the way of colors. On the other hand, you have some different shades of browns and grays. You've got the copper here, the roof trim. And then you've got this statement in the middle. You've got this lacquered bench. You've got this umbrella. I should point out, this is a typical traditional Kyoto silk paper umbrella. These are still made by hand. They're incredibly beautiful. This one's intentionally neutral, unlike the many of them. They're spectacularly decorated. And then you've got this sort of ikebana bowl, for lack of a better term, with the plants in it. Now, these plants will only last for 2 or 3 days. The peonies may be 3. So this arrangement will be changed every. I would think they probably change it every 2 days. You actually want it to age a little bit. You know, there's Japanese. They're trying to say a bunch of stuff. Now, to foreigners or anyone who's Japanese that doesn't read this, they just see this, very artsy, ikebana arrangement that sort of screams, I'm Kyoto, I've got style. And of course, the place that I'm a part of has style, but that is, of course, style on the other side of the door. With the idea that the insiders are obviously the insiders, the ones that put this out here. So the insiders got a lot of style. The outsiders going around generally don't. So tons of people go by. Lots of people a fair number of people would take pictures of this. Not as many as I thought. But then I can read parts of this. So this particular arrangement is changed every 2 or 3 days. It's supposed to reflect a particular set of days in the Japanese calendar. This is actually not cherry. This is plum. So this is plum and peonies. I'm not sure what this place was trying to message with the plum and peonies. I'm willing to bet that there was some sort of connotation that there's supposed to be a rain or, not a heavy rain, but some sort of a mist or some sort of rain happening that day or the next day. Or more likely, there's some sort of a real famous poem that was written about the canal or about this place, since this place is, from what I understand, about 400 years old, that mentioned something about plums and peonies or a rainstorm or something like that. So there's whole levels of this. There's levels of sophistication just in the way it's done. If you notice the total lack of symmetry, nothing here is symmetrical. This is at an angle. The table itself is asymmetrical. The arrangement is totally asymmetrical. Nothing about this is symmetrical. And we'll get into this in a little while, but symmetry is something that's Asians are absolutely adverse to. Even if something looks symmetrical, if you look at it carefully, it isn't, and that's intentional. They believe that symmetry is the gods. That's the realm of the kami and the gods. And if you try to do something truly symmetrical, you're calling the wrath of the gods on kami, because you're sort of saying, I'm as good as you guys. So everything has to be asymmetrical. And in that connotation, this place is obviously saying, not only are we sophisticated, not only do we know the rules, but we can actually present something that we know you'll never understand. So on one hand, it's pretty. On the other hand, you won't know what the message is, and you're not supposed to know what the message is because you ain't as smart as we are, and you're not part of our group. So it's sort of like a step way further than the guy writing the poetry in Beijing. He's inviting folks who are smart enough to be part of the group. This is basically at some point sort of like a very pretty, very sophisticated ad saying, keep out. You're not one of us. You can appreciate this. You might even appreciate, I'm sure there's had to be at least 20 or 30 levels I didn't get. But yeah, I mean, when you see this, you can appreciate it. But on the other hand, you just sort of resign yourself to the fact that, well, okay, fine. That's, they're cool. Here's another example of the same. This is my favorite area. This is Pontacho in Kyoto. That's one of the 2 old districts across the street from Gion. This is a small, I guess restaurant is the best term for it. Yeah, they're more sophisticated than restaurants, but I don't know the term in English. This is, again, incredibly small. It's very old. I've never gone into this place. I can't afford it. I would think in current terms, if you went in there to have dinner, it probably puts you back about $500 to $700 per person. It'd be worth it. But nothing against Chaminade, but I never got paid enough to actually do this. Um, this again it's a couple of weeks later, it's a year later, and if you notice the blooms have just started. Here's a cherry tree. Notice how the blooms are just coming out. So this is a little, well, as I mentioned before, it changes every year. Notice here what you actually have is part of a stone border. It's not a fence, it's a stone border. There's absolutely no way that it's a fence, even a small child can get across it. Notice again the total difference in textures. This is the name of the restaurant. Some of these are old. But again, this restaurant in one form or another has been around for ages. Some of the places in Pontecho, I mean, the buildings have been rebuilt, but the place, in the sense of that particular restaurant being at that location, might easily go back 400 or 500, 600 years. And I can guarantee a fair number of these guys are from that. They just sort of keep on lugging them around as they rebuild the building. So notice how you've got this. This has been bonsaied within an inch of its life. This poor tree has, every couple of days, someone goes out and trims a little bit, modifies a little bit. At some point, they probably wrapped parts of the trunk in string to make it bend a certain way or give it a certain shape. So everything here is calculated. Nothing here is accidental. On the inside, notice how, again, you've got another one of these umbrellas. You've got, I can't remember what this serves a function, but for some reason it escapes me. Notice how you've got a spectacular ikebana arrangement here. And of course, you can't see into the restaurant because it's none of your business what they're doing in there. So this is again, insider, outsider. This place you don't go into unless you've got an invitation. So they've got a customer list. It's like a club. You've got a customer list. Someone on the customer list might invite you to go in with them, but you just don't walk up and knock on the front and say, hey, is there room for two? Now they've got I don't know why they've got a display up here, because it is one of those places. So on one hand, they've got a display of what they have. On the other hand, you can't go in and sit down and order something. So I don't, who knows? It seems to me a very Pontecho type of thing to do. Though a lot of the restaurants in Pontecho don't even have any sort of menu, and in fact, in many cases, look like a doorway. This one just here, I didn't even bother taking a picture. It's just a doorway, it's just a stairway leading up, and that's supposed to be an even more exclusive restaurant upstairs. Not the same restaurant, another restaurant. And that one, if you don't know why you're there, you don't need to be there. And this is actually the same way. You can look at what they've got. In fact, I bet you they put this up so that people wouldn't accidentally walk in. Come on, I never thought of that before. Yeah, that's the other thing I can think of. But yeah, this is again style and sophistication against insiders and outsiders. And insiders would recognize the shape of this tree as an accidental. It's supposed to reflect something. I would suspect a famous piece of brushwork by somebody. The umbrella, the fact that the umbrella is brown, is probably some sort of play on the name of the restaurant or some famous patron of the restaurant. And again, even folks that go here probably don't know all the stuff going on with this. And I know that the lady who's got to be the hostess could probably spend a whole day nonstop for 6 to 8 hours explaining just what we're seeing in this picture and what it actually quote means unquote. But what you usually accept in Japanese society is when you see stuff like this, there's whole layers of meaning which you're never going to be privy to. And to a certain extent, that's fine. That's for insiders. You don't have the secret handshake, so it's none of your business. Now, this plays out at all levels. This is in front of one very tasty sake brewery in Takayama. So as I think I showed a picture before, there's like 10 breweries down the street. All the little family operations, they'll do they don't export anything at all. It all gets sold to locals and tourists in Takayama. I don't think any of this stuff even ends up in stores. Oh, wait, this place did say that they actually had two restaurants, one in Kyoto and one in Ginza in Tokyo, that actually got a limited amount of their sake. They literally would, send them like 10, I don't know, barrels, whatever you want to call them, big sake things. And when that was gone, they were just out. But this is another classic example of insider outsider. On one side, it's just a little decoration. Here's the water, thing, the water gutter here, the streets over here. So on one hand, it's just a little decoration. It's classic Ikebana, but it's a classic Takayama Ikebana, which has to do with, probably the lady that's the proprietor. I think it was a lady that actually, she was the senior member of the family, the EA there. So it was her, she was the senior. I don't think she was the brewmaster. I think there was a guy that was the brewmaster. Anyways, but it was her arrangement, I can almost guarantee. So what she's got here is you've got, very young bamboo. You've got, I can identify 90% of the stuff. But notice there's the use of colors. There's the use of an older Ikebana arrangement. So you change these every 2 days. It's like the second day. So what you do is you change these every 2 or 3 days. But you leave the container there. Now the container is getting old. It's by American standards, it's getting ratty. It's faded. Da, 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 da. That's intentional on the Japanese part. The older it gets, the more real it gets, for lack of a better term. And so again, my guess would be, since a lot of this stuff you see, there's a really famous Buddhist temple back up about half a kilometer away, back up the main road in the hills. I have a sneaking suspicion this might either allude to that in some way, shape, or form, or it might just allude to whatever neighborhood she's from, or maybe, just as a guess, it might allude to the place where they get the rice that they make the sake from. Any of those, or maybe some combination of the above. Anyways, so what you have is an arrangement. It's a very stylish arrangement. It's a very nice arrangement. And it's unintelligible to anyone who isn't an insider. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that, except for the folks maybe right around her neighbors, who, they've obviously known each other for probably hundreds of years. I bet you any other folks in Takayama, if they've lived there for, generations, probably have no idea what the sucker means. It doesn't mean they can't appreciate the style and the sophistication of it. Everything's very carefully laid out here. Even down to having the bloom leaning off the back. But it's not intended for consumption. If you notice, there's no plate out front explaining what the meaning of the parts is. And that's intentional. This is not a Japanese, in fact, Asians in general are very big on this idea of subtlety is a key part of the game that you play. And in fact, when you're dealing with strangers, we certainly had this several times, not so much in Japan, but certainly in China. I'm dealing with our archaeological counterparts. They would intentionally show you stuff with the idea that you wouldn't know what it was. And if you did know what it was, they were stoked. One, because that meant that you'd spend a fair amount of time learning shit you were supposed to learn. Two, it meant they could talk about stuff more openly because you had common values. They didn't have to educate you all the time. So on the same hand, you know that they're only showing you maybe 5% of what they actually know. And they're sort of assuming you're doing the same thing. So basically, everyone's dancing the dance all the time. I recommend highly, if you go to Japan or China, spend some time going over traditional literature. I'm a huge fan of Journey to the West. I'm also the marsh margin, or water margin. I'm also familiar with the poetry of Li Bo and a few others. Now that gives me an insight in that, when we were talking to some of the guys at the museum, the Shanxi Museum, they actually showed us a carved pillar of one of Li Bo's poems. And once they said the first part of it, they then stopped. And he was sort of watching us out of the corner of the eye, and both of us knew what the rest of the poem was. And that's not the secret handshake, but it implies that eventually you might be worth a secret handshake. If, on the other hand, you had no idea what they were talking about and were absolutely clueless, in other words, my stereotype of the classic American tourist, then they're just, at that point, they're just not going to waste their time with you. In fact, it came up later when we were drinking with them once. They were talking about they'd actually had some guys from UT, from University of Texas, that came by. And I think they showed them the same pillar. My bet would be they did. It had been a couple of years before us. And none of those guys recognized the pillar. They were archaeologists, but they had not spent a lot of time on Chinese culture. And at that point, it became really clear to the Chinese guys that they were never going to be able to do anything with the Texas guys, because the Texas guys might have had technical skills in terms of digging stuff up, but they were never going to understand anything that was Chinese. And so they very politely started telling them, well, don't call us, we'll call you. On the other hand, they were very happy with the fact that we had some clue, not much, but there was a start. There was a potential that this might grow into something. And that's what subtlety does. Indirection, that should become really clear. Go back to the folks with the deer and the idea of law. What you want to do is you indirectly allude to something rather than actually saying it or making it visible or making it obvious. Making something obvious in Asia is an insult. It implies that the person you're talking to is dumber than a post, and people would get really offended by that. In fact, Asians that come to the United States, at least folks that we have to come to Hawaii, get really upset if you explain stuff to them. They just get really pissed, sort of like, what, you think I'm so stupid I can't breathe? So indirection is an expected form of behavior. And doing it is a compliment to the person that you're interacting with, because one, it means that you want the relationship to stay smoothly, this idea of wa, again, or harmony. Secondly, is they're smart enough to figure out what's going on without you having to, write everything on their nose in front of their face. So yeah, indirection is hugely key. The classic American thing, a talk straight and don't bullshit. Given the fact that Americans actually do BS a lot, so I'm not sure where they get this idea that they have this as a value, but they love to think they do. Certainly see this even more here now that I've moved to Nevada. It's a big part of this whole sort of, Western straight talking way of doing stuff. And yet it's funny how when you actually watch people function, a lot of it's still based on indirection. It's just, there's this idea of perception of honesty and being forthright. That's the word I was thinking of. Asians don't have that. Japanese especially. Yeah, forthright is, they would just see that someone being an absolute asshole. It'd be just totally rude for no other reason than be rude. They can't see any value to it. In Asian society, this again was typical. If you're familiar with traditional Hawaiian education, Hawaiian education, like its Asian counterpart, did not mean what we're doing here. You did not sit people down and tell them stuff. What you would do would generally have them as like journeyman or apprentice. So if you in Hawaii, if you wanted to be a fisherman, you'd find a fisherman who would put up with you following them around, and you'd follow them around. You wouldn't ask them questions. You would just sit there and watch intently at absolutely everything they did. And I know because that's how I learned some of the stuff here. I was brought up in part by a guy who thought he was like the ultimate reincarnation of traditional Hawaiian values. And Francis was actually pretty good at it. But, he very early on, he just said, I'm not here to listen to you. You're here to keep your mouth shut and watch me. And that's Hawaiian education. And Asians are exactly the same way. You're not going to explain stuff to people. You're going to do stuff. And if you want to learn, you watch them. And this does two things. One is it as you're watching them do what they're doing, making one of those umbrellas, for example. You want to know how to make an umbrella, you journeyman or apprentice, do grunt labor for a guy making umbrellas. And as he's making them, you intently watch everything that he does. You don't ask him why he uses a particular piece of wood. You don't ask him why he uses a particular piece of silk string. You just watch him and you keep track, and in your head, you start cataloging what types of wood, what type of string. And so what happens is over time, of course, now you've built all that yourself. Unlike this class where I'm telling you guys stuff. So I can guarantee 90% of the folks it'll vanish within 5 seconds of hearing it. That's just Western education. In the Asian sense, as with the Hawaiian sense, since you have to figure it out yourself, you're going to remember because you cognitively you had to build that model up yourself. You didn't get it from anyone else. It wasn't given to you. Now, what that also does, that encourages empathy. As you're watching the guy making the umbrella, or you're watching the Hawaiian guy throw a net, you're also understanding their relationship with the world around them, the relationship with the folks around them, the relationship with maybe the folks that buy the umbrellas. You're going to become more and more, not necessarily more and more like them, but you're going to understand more and more about them. You're going to become more empathic. And since Hawaiian society, like Asian societies, are group-based societies, empathy is absolutely critical. If you go around with well, I'm me and I'm special and I'm different, that's the classic traditional Hawaiian definition of haole. And in the Japanese sense, it would be the traditional definition of gaijin. Your sense of self-worth and self-value is so big, it's amazing there's room in the universe for anyone else. At least that's their view of it. So on the other hand, if you learn through watching others and being grateful that others are willing to let you be there, maybe not as an active participant, but you're learning just by being there, then you're gaining empathy both to them, the population or group they represent, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't emphasize enough, if you're going to be part of groups, you have to be empathic. I don't know whether you're empathic just because you have it innately in you or you learn it, but boy, you better have it. Otherwise, you're never going to be part of a group. Importance of etiquette. In Asian societies, in fact, I would argue with almost all societies, with the exception of Western European. Um, in fact, I'm just thinking on one hand, Roman society, of course, is Roman law is basically the basis of modern Western law. But the funny thing about Roman law is Roman law only applied when you didn't have a network of relationships. So if I knew somebody and I did something wrong in the Roman system, so I get say arrested, I contact my sponsor or basically my OIA, since the Romans had almost the same thing. And all of a sudden, that law will just not happen. Whatever the punishment was, it won't happen to me. I got out of it. So Roman law was very much, actually, this isn't unusual, actually, even today in a lot of Europe. They have legal systems, legal codes. The Francophone system is actually the most common legal code globally, but it's frequently not followed completely. Other things take precedence. In Asian societies, and this is true in Hawaiian society also, you had no code of law. Kamehameha the first, once the Europeans show up, brings in Mama Laho, the idea of the law of the paddle. But even that was actually just like codifying etiquette. So what you have in Asian societies, especially Japanese societies, since it's the most brutal in this regard. Remember, I mentioned a bunch of presentations ago, you have the idea of the samurai. Samurai could walk around and whack a commoner, whack a peasant / serf. And the only cost was basically making a payment to clean the body off the street. You didn't owe the family anything. You really hadn't done anything wrong, per se, as long as you had the money to pay for the cleaning services. And so what you have is in Asian societies, since there was never a code of law, Chinese had a code of law, but again, it almost outside of the, Judge Bao videos never actually applies all the time. The reality is that in Asian societies, as in Hawaiian society and most societies, what you actually had was a code of etiquette, a code of accepted behaviors that kept everyone from being random elements bouncing into each other. Since in Japan, that could be, innately bad, since 5% of the population carried swords that could literally cut steel. So etiquette was critical. And this is one reason why in Asian societies, at least particularly when I'm familiar with both Chinese and Japanese societies, are very etiquette driven. And in my personal point of view, you can never be too polite in China and Japan. Chinese especially will go, oh, no, you don't need to do that. But they're never going to get pissed off if you're too polite. And it's always, at least in my experience, it's almost always seen as a positive, because it implies that you know enough about etiquette to treat them with respect in that way. In Japan, everything's done this way, especially with folks outside of your group. Since everyone outside of your group is an alien, that means that you're going to treat them with etiquette because you don't know what they represent. You don't know what group they're a part of, how powerful that group is, you don't know what that group can do or not do. So therefore, being polite, and politeness is a very complex phenomena behaviorally in Asia. It's a no-brainer, because if you do something and someone starts chasing you around with a sword, what are you going to do? Go, oh, wait, time out. If you look at Article 3, paragraph 7, you can't do that. You're going to be dead before the first 2 words got out of your mouth. So even in modern Asian societies, etiquette rules, codes of law, and even codes of generalized morality, which Buddhism has. Certainly, Buddhism has a very strong set of generalized morality, including even especially non-humans. But that doesn't mean that people follow it. They might, but as I mentioned a bunch of times before, that they choose to or choose not to. Etiquette is something everyone does. And the reason for that is even if you're dealing with strangers, if you don't follow etiquette, then that means that your mom brought you up wrong, especially in Japan. And of course, that means that people are going to start talking about you. And this is where we get especially like the Chinese and the idea of gossip. So people behave themselves not because they're going to have to go to some sort of a god or heaven or, so as St. Paul in the book or Thoth in the Egyptian system with the feathers of good and bad. This is just simply because if you don't follow etiquette, you're going to get dissed by folks, and someone's going to know somebody who knows somebody you know, and pretty soon the word's going to get around that Bordner was brought up wrong by his mom, and that's going to spill over to the family. So people follow etiquette because the unforeseen consequences of not following etiquette are so major that following etiquette is such like a much small price to pay. This is why I've seen this twice in Japan, where Americans were in both cases it was at hotels. They were checking in at hotels, and in one case I never did figure out what was not going right, and we were trying to listen in, but we couldn't hear it. Second case it was literally that they got the room that they ordered, but it wasn't the room that they thought they were going to get. And in both cases, the couples lost it. They started shouting, waving, and making noise. And of course, the Japanese just started to panic. Because but at the same time, you could just see, especially the Japanese managers in both cases, became absolutely stone-faced. And they were just basically saying, this is so effed up. It's so typical of outsiders, especially Americans. They just got their asses. They've got no sense of etiquette, and they're not even willing to pay attention to the fact that we do have etiquette. It's just the ugly American as tourists can be seen almost infinitely, and it's almost invariably, at least in my view, is a combination of this idea of individual self-importance, and also if I'm the most important person in the room, I don't have to follow etiquette because obviously, everyone should be sort of, subordinate or kowtow to me. Anyway, so we started. Human nature is tabula rasa. This is true of most societies. I think of outside the Judeo-Christian Islamic view of it. And these three religions, since they're all related, they're all from the same foundational base. They have a unique attitude that people are in a unique position vis-a-vis everything else. I'm thinking Noah and the ark. Noah builds the ark, not the animals. And then Noah puts all the animals in the ark. So Noah's obviously like the first park ranger. In fact, the idea of park rangers is a good example of this. In the rest of the world societies, almost without exception, there's a very strong attitude that people are part of the world. Humans are animals. Might be smarter animals. In most cases, in most of these societies, don't see people as the smartest animal, but they're one of the smarter ones. And therefore, people are parts of nature. We're not unique to nature. We're part of it. This gets played out in all sort of odd ways by Americans. One is that just like animals, you think of like people treat their pets, dog, cats, whatever. The dog or the cat might do something good or might do something bad. And it's sort of like, well, it's a dog. Dogs are going to do what dogs are going to do. So as I did it, because it's an animal, its behavior patterns are going to reflect the reality of being part of the animal world, animal kingdom. In most societies, that applies to people too. People are not seen as being inherently good or bad. People are seen as becoming good or bad by virtue of their upbringing and their behavior. So again, this is where mom comes in. If someone as an adult does something bad, that's because their mom failed years earlier. It's the nurture and nature, you might say. They don't buy the nature concept. They buy the total idea that human nature is nurtured. People become good or bad by virtue of this. Now, this gets a little spin because in the Chinese especially, but also in certainly Chinese, there's the idea of karma. So if you've been a bad person in a past life, you might start out this life with already on like minus 20 behavior points or something, because you're paying the piper for your bad behavior last time. So individuals might start off with not a necessarily clean sheet. As they would say, tabula rasa just means a clean sheet. But nonetheless, inherently that's the pattern. Because people are parts of nature, that means they're not superior or unique. So those kids interacting, or the high school kids interacting with the deer. On one hand, the deer are obviously not people. On the other hand, if you notice those folks acting with the deer weren't assuming superiority over deer. They weren't sure about what the deer were up to. But the deer are, considered another species out there. So you don't have this idea of superiority. Now, in a weird way, this, you see this in a bunch of ways. This is why in Asia, when guys get drunk, they very likely will just, shishi on the side of the road. Why? Because, Americans take their dogs out to shishi. You got to take your dog for a potty walk. Why would people be any different? So again, if you put people in the same package as the rest of animals, then all of a sudden the way that things tend to get treated is really different. Now, in a sad way, this is also why in almost all of Asia, you very rarely will see the equivalent like a humane society or society of prevention of cruelty to animals. Because if you think about it, if animals are part of nature and people are part of nature, then society, for the prevention of cruelty to animals should include people in it. So people aren't unique or different. Well, people are different just because the species is different. They're aware of that. But it doesn't mean that humans are special. They're just different. Next, future time versus present time. Americans, I would argue, are the most present-oriented population I know, but I suspect probably one of the most present-oriented ever. I won't pick on you individually, but collectively think about it with, say, 3 of your friends. Can they actually remember what was important within this week 5 years ago? Do they know who the major world leaders were 10 years ago? So Americans are entirely in the present. I think, my sad view of a lot of Americans is without their, iPhones and Alexa or whatever they've got that's giving them their memory, they wouldn't even know what was going on remember what was going on last month. And what that also means is they have no clear idea what's going on next week. So the future is a mystery. The past is a mystery because they've forgotten it already. So Americans live in the present. And to be honest, I see this a lot. This is the classic example of when are things due. The fact that people can't remember when things are due. When you gave them a calendar, they've got a schedule. They just don't bother to check it. They don't bother to do this. They don't bother to do that. Why? Because what's going on today is more important than what I might have to do tomorrow. So it's not really procrastination. Procrastination assumes that you know what tomorrow you're supposed to do and don't want to do it. I always say this is being clueless outside of the present. Americans are clueless about anything other than the present. Asian societies, as with many societies, are very future-oriented. So in Asian societies, things that you do now, you're calculating what the impact is going to be 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, maybe over 20 years down the road. So if you would, anything you do now or in the recent past, you take the long view in terms of what the impact is going to be. It's the absolute obverse of, immediate now orientation. And this applies, in everything. The Asian museum we work with, or I should say the Archaeological Society, the museums they work with, they have 20-year plans. Now, these 20-year plans are not only what they're going to do with the museum, but also what they think they're going to find archaeologically they're going to have to display in the museum in 20 years. This also includes the type of technology they think is going to be available in 20 years. Now, they're not necessarily right. It's not they can see into the future, but it's something that you're expected to think about and talk about. You don't exist just in what you've got today. It's not just the here and now, as they would say. In Asian societies, this is most true in Japanese society. Chinese and Koreans don't tend to be as big on this. But in Japanese society, this again, if you remember, this is like the spin-off of that Gambatte I mentioned earlier. Effort versus talent. In Asian societies, people are not hugely impressed if you have innate talent for something. Even Chinese and Koreans, much as they appreciate talent, they would much rather see someone who had 80% talent, but then worked really, really, really hard to gain the other 20% through effort. They're much less impressed with someone who's so damn talented that they don't need to spend any effort. I think Asian societies could be sort of summarized: if you didn't have to work for it, it probably isn't worth working for. Americans, on the other hand, love the idea that people are just innately talented. I'm thinking of all those talent shows, like America's Got Talent, stuff like that. Um, they very rarely, from what little I've ever seen of them, and I'm not watching very much, point out that a lot of these folks, might have spent the last 10, 15, 20 years of their life practicing something before they end up on a show. Um, so you in the United States, you downplay effort and you hyper the idea of talent. You're so skilled, you didn't have to work at it. Americans are really jealous of that. They really like it. In Asian societies, they're very cynically suspicious of it. So someone who spends a lot of time and effort getting ahead is a lot more credible, has a lot more credibility than someone who's just really smart. And so you see it's classic in the educational system. Japanese universities, especially companies that are hiring from universities, when looking at someone's, sort of university resume, I guess for lack of a better term, they would much, if they have two graduates who are sort of equally talented, or if one's even slightly more talented, but the other guy spent 3 years, trying again and again to get into university before he succeeded. And he's almost as talented as the first one who got in first time and all no trouble. They're going to hire the guy who tried for 3 years. And I think they're right. I think it's a smart move because that person's willing to focus time and effort on achieving a goal. The other person, on the other hand, might be so spoiled by their talent they've never actually had to work for anything. So they finally do have to work for anything that might just be an absolute failure. And I've actually seen this happen, especially with guys doing computer coding. So yeah, I'm totally on board with the Asian view of the effort versus talent thing. Okay. Well, actually, we've covered all these. Okay, relational orientation, individual. That's what I mentioned. Relational orientation is the idea that you see yourself as part of a group. Individual self-ego orientation is the idea that you self-identify. And what this also would be then is yeah, this is the way you tend to operate and function around others. The last, which I don't think we actually mentioned, and this is strangely Japanese. Sociobiology is the idea that your social behavior is biologically inherited. Now, most societies believe this, to a pretty great extent. And in Asia, it's a given. So in Asian societies, your abilities, not, for example, not so much, for example, how much temper you have, but your innate structured ability to not have emotional control of your temper all the time would be seen as sociobiology. In other words, you inherited that from your relatives. This is why in Japan, people spend so much time worrying about who they marry. Because if you're going to inherit behavior, that means that the family you've married into, if you're the new wife and your husband's family is the one you've married into, you need to know everything about his family. Because at some point, everyone in the family, both families, is convinced that whatever kids you have will inherit behavioral potential from the two halves of the family, the husband and wife's families. So, this is a huge part of Asian society in that regard. As I think I mentioned a little bit in passing in Chinese society and also in Korean society, the date that you're born, the actual calendrical date, is an important part of who you are. In the same way, that also contributes to your sociobiology. The day that you pop out of your mom actually has a set of behavioral social additives that it puts into you. And this is a key part of the whole idea of feng shui and ming shui, especially ming shui in Chinese society, is the idea of figuring out what was added to your potential or taken away from your potential in sociobiology by virtue of the date of birth. Japanese don't really do that very much. They were really big on what's A and B blood types about 20 years ago, but I think that's gone. In Japan, they have a strange variant of all this. So Nihon being the Japanese population, being Japanese, if you would, at some point, I think they've had this for at least 1,500 years, maybe longer. I don't know. You'd have to go back in time machine. They built up this into a real complex logic, which is that the people that are Japanese, and this by ethnic Japanese, have sort of magically over time developed. And they would argue because of their position, because of space, social, emotional radiation in the Japanese home islands, are different than anyone else. So therefore, over time, the people who were born and raised as Japanese in Japan became a unique subspecies of the human species, Nihonjin. Now, this idea of ethnic uniqueness, and usually sort of implication is ethnic superiority is not unique. Most societies have this, ethnocentrism. What makes it really odd in the Japanese case is it becomes very explicitly, one becomes this idea of blood Japanese. So you have to be of Japanese heritage on both sides of the family to be truly Japanese. Now, what this means also is you have to do this in Japan physically. The minute you physically leave Japan, you lose that spiritual charge, I don't know how better to phrase it, that keeps you being Japanese. Now, the classic way you see this, and this is still true today, is that if someone is Japanese, and we'll say their dad gets, assigned to the Toyota office in London, so he takes his family with him to London, and he has to stay there for, say, 2 years. And we'll say you're his kid and you're a junior in high school, no, freshman in high school. The obvious thing is obviously that now you've lost your network of your social relationships, your network of classroom kin, if you want to think of it that way. But what also happens is we'll say for some reason you don't go back to Japan. I don't know if any Japanese wouldn't, but for some reason you don't go back to Japan till his 2 years up. So he moves back to Japan. You're now a junior in high school. What you're going to find is the Japanese Ministry of Education, or the Japanese government ministry, will place you in a unique school, for lack of a better term, for strange people. And the reason they put you in this special school is that you've been gone from Japan for over 18 months. And that's the rule for the Japanese Ministry of Education. If your dad sends you back in 16 months, which is what they've had a premium do, then you spend like a week or a couple of weeks or better, even a month in Japan. Then you're cool for another 18 months. Though actually probably should limit it to a year. But if for some reason you didn't, then what would happen is when you went back to Japan, as far as the Ministry of Education is concerned, as far as Japan after that, all the way through when you finally keel over and die, you're never going to be truly Japanese because you were gone for too long. And at some point you lost that, emotional, social, magic link to the Japaneseness that makes up the really Japanese. Now, this is one aspect that's very hard for Japanese that were born and raised in Hawaii, especially like some of my friends. I mean, they speak Japanese at home. Their families their family's more conservative than Japanese in Japan. But if they actually, I know of 2 cases where they actually went to Japan thinking, I'm going to go back to quote the home country, unquote. Totally not accepted by Japan. Now, I think I mentioned this when I was talking about language. In one way, this is because they speak Japanese too well. They're not blood Japanese. They're not Nihonjin because they weren't born and raised in Japan. So the fact that they speak perfect Japanese, look Japanese, act Japanese, makes Japanese really creeped out because it's sort of like it's like a Frankenstein. They look, talk, and seem like it, but they're not. So you're a fraud, for like, and it's really brutal, but no, that's certainly true. If on the other hand, you realize this and you intentionally make little mistakes, then the Japanese are going to love you because you speak real Japanese. They don't have to be awkward and think about what they're going to do in front of you. And on the other hand, every time you open your mouth, you get to be reminded, I know I'm not really Japanese. So to be truly Japanese, it's not a matter of language. It's not a matter of culture. It's a matter of literally being in the home islands from birth to death. Now, the weird thing about this is then, when we're working with our clients in Japan, and my wife, Chinese, and me being Haole, we actually are, when we're dealing with some folks there, especially the more conservative members of some of the businesses, they actually like having the 2 of us there with one of their folks who's, superbly competent in English, as many Japanese are, rather than having one of the, Hawaiian-born Japanese there who make them really uncomfortable. Because in our case, the minute they look at us, they know, okay, no problems here. We know these folks are different. They know they're different. Everyone knows how's the game's played. They're very uncomfortable about Hawaiian-born Japanese, for example, it's even more so mainland American, I'm sure, in that they would assume that behaviors that they can get away with in front of me, for example, because I won't know enough to interpret their behavior, facial, body, whatever it might be, someone from Hawaii might. And so you're never sure what you can get away with. So you always have to be really, really careful how you behave, what you say, how you act, because person might know everything about what you're actually saying. And that's, I can sort of see, I can see their point. It makes sense to me. So what this also means is Japanese have no ability to absorb outsiders. Population's been dropping like like a broken elevator. Huge. I think it's 20, 22, 24% of the population, something in the 20s, are over 65 years of age. And a lot of those folks are over 75 years of age. So they're old. And this really struck us when I went to Lake Biwa, which is the lake outside of the big, huge natural lake outside of Kyoto, which is sort of seen as an adjunct. So it's sort of like a whole farming towns and stuff that are all sort of tied to the Kyoto network, you might say. I mean, you go through these cute villages, and we went through one village, I can't remember the name of it, where I don't think I saw anyone under what looked like the age of 100. I mean, I'm sure they weren't that old, but these were folks that had literally spent their entire lives out in the farm fields, and they were old. I mean, the ladies all had sclerosis. They were all bent over. I'm still working, 10, 12 hours a day. The guys made me feel young again. And I'm not young. And you didn't see anyone between the ages of 20 and say 60, unless they were like driving a truck, maybe in a convenience store, a combini, but even them, the folks usually were there were really old, or some sort of government official, someone working for the governments, local or state or whatever, or police, for example, were all younger, or the teachers. But boy, outside of that, it was like, oh, it was really creepy. Now, what the Japanese have realized for the last 40, 50 years is they have to import non-Japanese in for all sorts of support positions, elderly care, taking care of old folks, all sorts of, junk jobs, because there's so few younger Japanese that to a certain extent they can pick and choose the jobs. And so if Japanese don't want to do it, they're not going to do it. And you can't make them do it because there's a labor shortage. So you bring in folks, whether it be from the Philippines or wherever, Europe, and they would be the ones that would take over those. And that was actually the plan through the 90s into about 2020, to actually about COVID, but just before COVID. What then happened was a rebound and an anti non-Japanese or anti-foreigner movement became really strong. It's even stronger now, and I don't understand it because it makes no sense. Japanese are putting themselves in a situation where old folks have no care system. There's a lot of stuff that's not getting done because there's really no one to do it. And this is because Japanese won't tolerate folks from outside. Now, the weird thing about that is you're actually dealing with individual Japanese or Japanese in particular places. And I know because, again, some of my relatives have spent, actually lived for Japan for a while. Japanese are really nice. If you're Japanese, are very comfortable with outsiders, as long as there's no surprises, in a small or even group setting, and for example, a neighborhood. But once you get outside of that, it's sort of like, what are you doing here? Who do you think you are? Do you think you're actually going to be able to live here forever? And so this has become the dominant discussion, and their society is going to fall apart because they believe so strongly in this geosociobiology, which is a Bordner term. I'm very proud of this, of Nihonjin as being totally unique, that they're putting themselves in a situation that their population is literally disappearing as we speak. The Japanese population shrinks every day. And that doesn't include the folks that are getting older every day. So it's a surreal situation. And you don't have some areas, it's not like China where some areas have more population. You can move folks from point A to point B, whatever. And then Chinese can give a rat's ass what you are. If you speak Mandarin perfectly and you follow the rules the way you're supposed to, they could care less if you have the three heads. It really isn't a big deal as long as you're not going to marry the daughter. So yeah, it's not a Chinese thing at all. Chinese are very inclusive if you follow the Chinese way of doing stuff. Japanese are totally exclusive, regardless of how well you know the stuff. And this would include, for a while, they were actually recruiting Brazilian Japanese, a large population of Japanese moved to Brazil at the same time as they moved to Hawaii for the same thing, sugar, back in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And so there's a large population in Brazil of Brazilian Japanese. Unlike Hawaii, they've never intermarried with the other populations. So they're still largely ethnic Japanese. They just happen to be in Brazil. And so starting in the 1990s, the Japanese government, provincial governments especially, started recruiting young Brazilian Japanese to come to Japan with the idea, we'll make you permanent residents and you'll provide this, 20 to 40-year-old population to do sort of the junk jobs that we don't have people to do. And, given the economic situation in Brazil, a fair number of folks jumped on this. As of 2 years ago, they all got their visas revoked, even though they've been prominent permanent citizenship. No, now we changed our mind. Been nice knowing you guys. All of a sudden, bang, after maybe 10, 15 years, they find themselves back in Brazil with nothing. It's insane. Yeah. Japanese function off of emotion. Japanese don't function off of practicality. This is probably the quintessential example of that.